So the third method we're looking at is to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. And here we're specifically looking at a, the leading coefficient, equal to 1. This is a difficult process. It's probably right up there with long division. So if you enjoyed practicing long division, you're going to enjoy practicing solving by completing the square. But it's one of those useful processes. We use them when we're working with circles. We use them when we're working with quadratic equations. So in your test, in your final exam, if we ask you to solve by completing the square, this is the method we ask you to show us. You cannot solve by factoring. You cannot solve using the square root method. You cannot use the quadratic formula. If we ask you to complete the square, this is what we want to see. All right, so let's do this. The first step is to set the equation to equal 0. So I see here I'm going to have to add 12 to both sides. The second step is to bracket the first two terms. Now we want to create a perfect square trinomial in the brackets. Remember, we just did that. We said you need 2 times a number, and then whatever that number is, we're going to square it. So if I look at this one, actually, before I do that, let's rewrite this. So we have x squared plus 8x. I need some room to create my perfect square trinomial. And then we're going to leave some room for step 4. Okay, create a perfect square trinomial. So this is going to be 2 times some number. Well, we know it's 2 times 4. That means I'm going to use the 4 here to create my perfect square trinomial, plus 16. Now, this is when you should all be saying, wait a minute, how did that happen? Before you put in the 16, this equation was equal to 0. You can't just put a number in and say it's still equal to 0. That's why we have step 4. Step 4 tells us to balance the equation. So if we put in 16, we need to take out 16. I can look at this 16 minus 16 and get 0. It's like it never existed. Now we want to factor and simplify the left side. Remember that we're using this number for factoring. So we have x plus 4 all squared, and then 12 minus 16 is -4. This equals 0. This should look familiar to you. This should look like the square root method that we were using last lecture. And step 6 says solve for x using the square root property. So we can add 4 to both sides. And now we know when we take the square root of both sides, we have 2 equations. X plus 4 equals the square root of 4, and x plus 4 equals the negative square root of 4. When I subtract 4 from both sides, I see that x could equal -2. And here, -6. When you get nice integer answers like this, it tells you you could easily have factored this equation to solve it, but we wanted to practice using the square root property. So again, 2 solutions. If you're asked to separate them by a comma with x equals, there it is. If you're given brace brackets and asked to separate your answers by a comma, there that is. By this time, you should know that you can use the homework assignments in Pearson to help you figure out how to put answers in correctly. And that's something that's really important to know heading into the final exam. All right, 2 questions for us to work on. Solve by completing the square. Why don't you pause the video and use the steps I've given you to see how far you can get on your own. Step 1 says make the equation equal 0. Step 2 said to bracket the first 2 terms. Step 3 said to create a perfect square trinomial in the brackets. So we left some room there to do that. We know that we have to think of 2 times a number and then square that number. It's going to be 2 times -1 equals -2, and -1 all squared is +1. In order to balance the equation, we're going to subtract 1. +1 minus 1 gives us 0. It's as if we never used that number at all. Now we factor our perfect square trinomial using that 1, of course. Simplify, -1 minus 1 is -2. That equals 0. We're going to use the square root property now to solve this equation. So we add 2 to both sides, take the square root, and it gives us 2 equations. X minus 1 equals the root of 2, and x minus 1 equals the negative root of 2. When we add 1, we see we have 2 solutions. Again, we could write this as x equals 1 plus root 2, comma, 1 minus root 2, or we could say this is 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. Give question 2 a try. Follow the steps that you were given. So you made the equation equal 0. I always like to keep x squared positive. You bracketed the first 2 terms. Now we're going to create a perfect square trinomial inside the brackets. So we see that this is 2 times -3 to give us -6. And -3 squared is +9. In order to balance the equation, we're going to subtract 9 because 9 minus 9 equals 0. We need to factor. Oops, that's not what I wanted at all. X minus 3 all squared. Simplify, 3 minus 9 is -6 equals 0. And of course, you had to finish this up using the square root property. When we take the square root, we find that we have x minus 3 equals the positive root of 6, and x minus 3 equals the negative root of 6. Adding 3 to both sides, we have 2 solutions. X equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 6. I'd like you to take some time right now and do these practice questions. It's important that you're really comfortable using the square root, or sorry, the completing the square method before we look at questions where a does not equal 1. In fact, right now, why don't you do question 3? The first thing you should do here is, of course, open the brackets. Now you can follow the steps that were given in the lecture. We subtracted 3 from both sides to make the equation equal 0, bracketed the first 2 terms, and now we're going to create our perfect square trinomial inside the brackets. Remember, when you have the square root of a radical that can be simplified, you need to do so. The square root of 28 can be simplified to 2 root 7. So we have two solutions here when I subtract 5 from both sides. We see that x equals -5 plus or minus 2√7. Make sure you finish the rest of those before going on to the next video lesson.